When I sent out, or when AC sent out an announcement about this talk, I had hoped to be able to present cross-cultural data, and I had been analyzing the cross-cultural data, examining the relationship between religion and allocare generally. And then it occurred to me towards the end of last week that this didn't make sense to lump all forms of allocare together, because there may be different costs and benefits to patrilineal member of the family looking after a kid versus a matrilineal member, and those two things might be facultatively responsive to what the other side is doing. So I recoded a lot. I recoded and worked on the Gambian data, and Redeem was able to split all of the allocare into matrilateral versus patrilateral and separate out paternal kin. And we weren't really able to do that for any of the other sites yet. So today I'm just going to unfortunately focus only on the Gambian analyses, but I will talk a little bit about the cross-cultural analyses and also the implication that these data have for the cross-cultural analyses. So as many of you know, evolutionary anthropologists and demographers have long been interested in explaining variation in relative fertility within and between populations and how these differences may or may not correspond to fitness maximization. Much of this work has applied evolutionary perspectives to the low fertility associated with contemporary industrialized societies and the downstream fitness effects of fertility reductions associated with transitions. In doing so, researchers have stressed how fertility reductions may be due to the increased costs of rearing children in contemporary labor economies and the high levels of parental investment they require, particularly investment in children's education. Adjacent work argues that kin dispersal due to these markets results in a reduction of the kin-based networks that support female reproduction and correspond to lower fertility. Meanwhile, others have focused on how norms for low fertility can spread rapidly via social learning mechanisms. Very few evolutionary researchers, however, have drawn their attention to the strong differences in relative fertility in these contemporary environments and how these might be associated with variation in religious involvement, nor how this variation in fertility may impact fitness. For example, in 2015, a sect of Amish, the Andy Weaver, Ohio Amish, which are obviously in Ohio in the United States, a leader in that group had total fertility of 6.29, while a layperson had slightly lower fertility, but still very high fertility. This is a fairly conservative Amish group, although not terribly conservative. There are more conservative Amish groups. Meanwhile, in that same year, in roughly the same context in North America, atheists exhibited below replacement fertility of 1.6. Now, these dynamics play out across the world, where in general, religious people tend to have higher fertility. This map just shows fertility by religion, and these are Pew data that many of you are probably familiar with. It shows that the highest fertility is in Africa. But within each of these contexts as well, even in high fertility contexts, their data suggests that religious affiliation and religious involvement is associated with increases in fertility. Now, humans, like all organisms, and regardless of environment, face trade-offs in how to best allocate the limited resources available to them. The more children parents have to care for, the less time and energy parents can invest in each child. Studies have documented this trade-off and found that family size is negatively related to a child's cognitive and physiological development, as well as their socioeconomic success in adulthood. Many of you will be familiar with this study. I think is the best graphic presentation of this effect of work by David Lawson and colleagues from a Swedish multi-generational study with over 10,000 people born between 1915 and 1929, plus all of their direct descendants. On the x-axis is the number of siblings, and on the axis is standard deviation changes, and you can see that more siblings is associated with reductions in family income, school marks, and the strongest effect, which is entering university, where more siblings equals worse outcomes. We would therefore expect, due to differences in family size, children born to religious parents to fare less well in terms of developmental outcomes than children born to secular parents. Yet, while there have been few studies that compare the success of religious and secular children, the available evidence suggests that at least some religious parents don't face such steep trade-offs between child number and child outcomes. So, for example, these data are from Gibbs et al. From using general social surveys in the United States, which examine the effect of sibling number on educational outcomes and years of education. You can see there's a strong negative effect of number of siblings on education. However, and I always struggle to interpret interaction terms, thankfully the authors do so in the text, there's an effect of being raised Mormon such that the effect of sibling number on educational attainment is about 2/3 less for Mormons compared to other religious groups such as Protestants. And interestingly, this effect seems to only hold among people who are born Mormon. So this suggests that there's something not necessarily just about being Mormon, but being embedded in a family of Mormons. So how might Mormons and other religious groups mitigate the costs of high fertility that we see amongst other groups? Collaborators and I, many of whom are with us today, integrate two lines of research to propose, and so far we preliminarily tested a solution to this, what we've called the paradox of religious fertility. First, studies consistently find that religious people tend to be more cooperative with one another than their secular counterparts. Second, we incorporate a cooperative breeding model of human reproduction and recognize that despite prolonged investment in children, human females exhibit shorter interbirth intervals and have more offspring than our closest great-ape relatives. High fertility is accomplished in part by substantial energetic contributions to children by alloparents. Cross-cultural studies find that under diverse ecological conditions, older siblings, fathers, and adult kin make substantial investments to children. These are critical to child survival and child well-being, and they have generally been argued to contribute to the demographic success of humans over our evolutionary history. Now, we've hypothesized that religious cooperation extends to alloparenting, and that higher levels of cooperation among religious mothers with both kin and non-kin enables larger family sizes without huge detriments to offspring. We also predict that support to religious mothers would indirectly impact child developmental outcomes. And as I stated, in other words, we anticipate through all of these mechanisms, religious cooperation might mitigate the cost of high fertility to children. Now, many of you will have either authored or be familiar with our earlier work, both in Western societies, the first here in New Zealand, where we use data from the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study. The models, the N in the models differ depending on the models, but it's roughly between 5,000 and 10,000 individuals. And we found that non-breeding members of the population, so people who don't have kids, or people whose kids are adults, among that group, religious people tend to look after other people's children more often than non-religious people. And that in general, fertility is associated with different levels of alloparenting, such that groups with higher fertility have higher levels of alloparenting. So these data were suggestive, but they definitely weren't a rigorous test. Subsequent work used the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children to test some of these ideas further. And we found, similar to other studies, particularly in the West, that The intensity of religious involvement, here just measured as frequency of church attendance, as you can see on the left, is associated with a greater number of offspring. These data were analyzed over a 10-year period from the year the focal child in the study was born until the child was 10, so additional siblings. The survey itself had a measure of co-religionist aid, so whether or not someone from your religion helped you, and that binary variable, as you can see on the plot on the right, was associated with increases for infertility across the 10 years of data that we analyzed. Now, we also use these data to examine child outcomes, and so these are the results of 3 different models. And if you haven't seen data presented like this, to the left side of the dotted line means there's a negative relationship, to the right side of the dotted line means there's a positive relationship. Each of the 3 models, or each of the dots, is associated with one form of standardized test upon entering school. In England, I think when the child is 4 or 5, and then 5 or 6, and then 8 is the WISC-3, which is kind of like an IQ test. These tests are, of course, biased, and our models reveal evidence of bias, but you can see at the top that the more siblings a child has, the poorer that child performs on these tests. You can also see where the second and third arrow are pointing that support to the mother, both general support, but also aid from co-religionists, is also associated with increases in these tests, at least at later stages of development. Now, these data were all suggestive, but whether or not somebody helped you as a binary measure of aid isn't a very rigorous test or rigorous measurement, at least of allocare. So while our previous work was suggestive, it really wasn't able to capture much nuance with respect to alloparenting. Indeed, our current study that I'm going to talk more about here today was undertaken to more broadly understand alloparenting, and not just with respect to religion. Theoretical work in evolutionary anthropology stresses the importance of alloparenting in human evolution. However, many studies on the topic infer relationships by the presence of a carer in the home, or the presence, or whether or not that person is alive. There are exceptions, of course. And with these data, relationships between particular carers and positive outcomes are mixed. For example, the presence of paternal grandparents sometimes has a positive effect, sometimes has a negative effect, or sometimes has no effect on a child's health outcomes. So our study was designed to build from this earlier work and to collect high-resolution data on alloparenting and child outcomes. Existing work suggests that allocare is highly variable, with tremendous variation in who cares for children across cultures. Now, despite this variation, there's still a trend towards individuals to invest more in children related through females rather than males. And Rebecca's work in Canada in the Gambia, which I'll talk a bit more about in a second, suggested that the maternal grandmother is particularly important, so that over 25 years of data where she compared the 4 different grandparents as well as mothers and fathers to child survival and nutrition, it was only the maternal grandmother that seemed to play a role. And much of the literature on allocare stresses grandparents, in particular the maternal grandparents. But aunts and uncles are also important, and I just have included in Pittsburgh because that's one of our field sites. But also, although the data are problematic because they're student data, I was a student in the class at a much later stage than 97 or 2002, but I thought I would include it anyway. What's interesting about the matrilateral bias, or the bias towards daughters and their offspring, is that this is been shown even in patrilocal and patrilineal societies where residence and distance from maternal kin is greater than patrilineal kin. In general, the argumentation for why this should occur is paternity certainty, and that individuals related through women are always certain that they are indeed related. But there's also evidence, particularly in patrilocal societies, that because inheritance is divisible within patrilocal and patrilineal settings, that individuals through men compete over resources. So perhaps there's a reduction in care through those lines because of that competition. Now, in terms of how these dynamics may be influenced by religion, as I mentioned at the beginning, I felt it was important to split out the different forms of care. And while Rebecca found in her earlier work in this same site that fathers didn't seem to have a role, there has been some argumentation that perhaps paternal care is facultative, so that if there's more allocare, fathers will reduce their care. So perhaps if they are not modeled together, one would not see an effect if they're sort of hydraulic. And also, I think it's important to do so in the cross-cultural data. As Herdy notes, there's more variation in paternal care amongst humans than in the rest of primates put together. And so I want to think about that separately in the models that I discuss here. There has been some theorization by evolutionary psychologists, which uses a very different model than the one that we've been working with, in that it focuses mainly on the man and woman as the child-rearing relationship, and argues that religion supports particular reproductive strategies in contemporary societies. And one of the ways it does so is by communicating paternity, women communicating paternity certainty to men, and in return, they get higher levels of paternal investment. So we might expect with our data that women who are more religious might have husbands who invest more in their kids. Patrilateral investment, or investment through males, through the male line, may work similarly by communicating paternity certainty to the entire male kin group. That if part of the reason for increased allocare along the matriline is paternity certainty, it's not clear to me that this would, or how this would impact matrilateral investment. But it seems to me that more general evolutionary theorizing about religion and how religion may function to bond tight-knit social groups that deter cheating and encourage reciprocity, that we might see this kind of function of religion, particularly in male-centered societies like patrilocal, patrilineal settings such as the Gambian. So as most of you will know, we collected data in 5 locations to test the sorts of ideas that I've been talking about, but others more generally. In societies that range in degree of market integration, but also in different types of religion: Hindus, Muslims, Christians, atheists, and the extent to which many of those groups are either in the majority or minority, because there seems to be, in some contexts anyways, effects of minority group status on fertility, where minorities in general tend to have higher fertility. Minority religious groups generally tend to have higher fertility. Our data we employed, to collect our data, we employed a cross-cultural mixed methods approach. Ideally, prior to attempting to do anything, we had hoped to interview 1,000 women, and where 500 of those women were currently reproductive, 45 years or older, and 500 of them were post-reproductive, 46 years or older. Currently reproductive is 45 years or younger, post-reproductive is 45 years or older. As many as 750 of their husbands, and then 2 focal children for each woman. We had focus groups in advance of data collection to adapt local questions to the field site. And then we also had separate focus groups just to collect qualitative data to hope to understand the way that religion and fertility and cooperative parenting and alloparenting more generally may be operating in each of these sites. So we collected data, a lot of demographic data, religion questions, social network questions, allocare questions, and health and anthropometrics. So here's just two pictures of those focus groups, the left from the Gambia and the right from Malawi. The core of our questionnaire consisted of a name-generating style social network section. We asked women who helped them provide direct care as well as resources to their focal children. We also asked about non-child care help, loans, food. Radim talked about that in our last seminar. I won't talk about that here today. Once that list of names was generated, we then looped through them to get information about each person, including their relationship to the woman. Lastly, we asked how often they received help from each carer. And then, so the analyses that I'm going to describe today lump allocare into direct allocare, which is based upon, in the last 2 weeks, who has helped wash, cook, play, or supervise the focal child. And the categories you can see there range from multiple times per day to not at all. And then provisioning allocare, which consists of food, money, gifts, or medical care in the last 3 months. So it's a different time scale. And there's also a different scale as well. So the data that I will describe today come from West Kiang in the Gambia, where there are about 14,000 people, mainly Mandinka, and the majority of the data are collected from Mandinka speakers. Overwhelmingly Muslim population with a high fertility rate of 5.5, at least about probably 8 years ago when this was collected. I should say too that, and it'll be a little bit more evident from the next slide, that the field site is maybe 5-ish hours from the capital city where you fly into, by road that's mostly paved and becoming more paved, and was becoming more paved while we were collecting data. The society is patrilocal, where women tend to marry men or go to live with the men that they marry. Patrilineal, reckoning descent through males, and polygynous, one man is married to multiple women up to 4. So these are the 23 villages that we collected data from. The one that you can maybe see the red circle around in the center is Keneba, which is where the MRC that we collaborated with is based. The red road is, or the red line is a paved road and was paved throughout data collection. The blue line was a dirt road that by the time of it were collected is about a third paved towards the west. But you can see even then many of the villages are far from even a dirt road. I mean, there are dirt roads that go to them, but they're very far from sort of a lot of market development, I guess. Just to give you an idea of the household structures. So while the society is patrilocal, a lot of the women come from the villages or nearby villages, so that there still is access to matrilateral kin. This is a relatively poor compound. You can see the wall on the house is on the right, but their houses are walled in. This is only one household, which is sort of, they're long, where wives will have a separate room with kids living in them. The wealthier houses will have brick walls around them, and bigger patrilocal residencies will have more males with more related males with more of their wives and other kin within one big compound. So this is the sort of best picture I have of what a compound in a house looks like, but these can be way bigger and way more complicated. Now, in terms of measuring religion, and this is probably something I would like to discuss a little bit more at the end of the talk. Radim has worked, and Laura before him, a long time trying to create religiosity scores for the field site. And the way the study was designed, I think we did a really good job of trying to adapt our religion questions to the local context, but we asked a whole battery of questions. We held focus groups in advance. But I'm not sure that the way that we conceptualize religiosity in the West, which is largely based by the way that psychologists do it, is all that meaningful. And I know Mary has been working on this in South Asia as well, where different features of religion may be having different effects socially. And so by collapsing them, we may erase them. In the Gambia, we have a different problem, and I suspect this is a problem in South Asia amongst Muslims as well, in that there's very little variation in many of our measures. So this is just how many times did you pray yesterday? I don't know how well you can see this on your screen. I probably should have done a better job. But you can see that roughly 680 people prayed 5 times yesterday, and maybe 10 didn't pray at all, maybe 5 twice, 5 4 times, maybe 5 sometimes. There's basically no variation in this question at all, which in the West or in Christianity would exhibit a great deal of variation. So after looking at different measures, and with the idea that what we're really interested in is how religion is communicated socially, Radim and I decided to use these 2 questions as a measure of religiosity, particularly because they are extra in addition to standard mosque and prayer that everybody does anyway. So the question on the plot on the right is derived from a question of the number of religious or faith-based activities involving other people that is not prayer or service at a mosque. And these could be listening to sermons in group prayer outside of the mosque, these kinds of things. So you can see there's almost normal variation in this. And while there's still, not a huge number of nones, there's at least normal variation. And then the question on the left is, how often do you do these things? So in the remainder of the description of the analyses, these are what I'm going to call religion or religiosity, is these 2 measures. Although this is worth further discussion later. So in terms of the total numbers of allocarers, not the total volume of care, but the total numbers of allocarers by type and kin group, you can see that most women do not receive any. So the biggest category is no allocare. But of those women who receive some, most comes from matrilateral kin, which is consistent with other studies showing that matrilateral kin investment is higher even in patrilocal societies. You can see that when women do get some help, they usually get help from one person, although some women get a lot more help. You can also see that there's more help with direct care than with provisional. Interestingly, so if you just see at the bottom, like these are the number of total social ties, and this includes cooperative networks. It's not just allocare, but about half of all of women's social network, if we can call it that, is matrilineal kin, even in a patrilocal setting. I had thought for a while to partition out the mother's grandmother or the woman who we're interviewing, her mother, but only 200 of the 7,000 women in the woman's social network in these data are the focal child's maternal grandmother. So we can pull that out, and you do see some small effects, positive effects, but the coefficients are very wide because they're just not that widespread in our data. And these are so it could be because they're deceased. And what I'm talking about here is just the portion of the data that are currently reproductive women. So these aren't the post-reproductive women. So they're even in women who are the younger half of our sample, most of their mothers are not contributing a great deal of help. They're not part of their networks. Now, in terms of care scores, it'll take me a second to sort of explain these. So the care questions were different for different age children and included a different number of questions. So we had to create standardized scores for different cares. So what we did was we first converted, this was Radin's idea, all values to 0 to 1, where 0 is that type of care is never practiced, to 1 is the maximum category, which is multiple times per day. These values were then summed and then divided by the number of types of care asked for that child. So for paternal care, a direct care score of 0.60 means that a father looked after his child a few times a week. 0.8 would mean once a day, and 1 would mean multiple times a day. For the alloparenting scores, they're on a different scale because they were created similarly, but because they're multiple individuals, they can and sometimes do sum to greater than 1. So basically, they're created the same way as the father, but then they are added together. So what you can see here is that fathers are contributing, at least comparatively, although they're on a different scale, you can compare them here. Just in terms of relative investment, because these are frequencies. So fathers are contributing more than either patrilateral or matrilateral kin in it individually, but less than them combined. So the allocare, at least at direct care for young children, more investment is coming from people other than father. And you can see that matrilateral and patrilateral kin are roughly equivalent for young children, but for older children, patrilateral kin declines in importance, whereas matrilateral kin remains relatively high. Paternal investment remains relatively constant across those two age groups as well. To examine the effect of religion on these types of care, we built Bayesian regression models with uninformative priors. I'm going to take you through 3 sets of models. One is a fertility model, where we assess fertility as age of onset of reproduction and age-adjusted fertility. Because the data are clustered by village, we use village as a random intercept. And then a separate set of models for allocare, where we look at the different types of allocare, either direct or provisioning, and also whether that kind of care comes from fathers, matrilineal or patrilineal kin. I can talk through why we used the covariance we did, if you'd like. And then also 2 measures of health, the number of illnesses the child had, as well as mother-rated general health. And I think this is worth talking a bit about later after the talk is over as well. So in terms of fertility, mother's religiosity, and this is the entire sample of the currently reproductive women. Age-adjusted fertility is associated with, mother's religiosity is associated with higher age-adjusted fertility, where age-adjusted fertility was calculated as the residual of a linear regression of number of births on maternal age. It's also associated with earlier onset of reproduction. These relationships are flipped in more market-integrated settings, and also in wealthier households, which is consistent with sort of embodied capital models of the way that fertility changes in market economies. Now, in terms of the numbers of allocares, I should say, again, that these are 4 different models, and these 4 models are separated by direct or provisioning, and then matrilateral versus patrilateral. So these are just numbers of cares, and you can see that mother's religiosity is associated with increases in both forms of matrilateral allocare, and 1 form provisioning patrilateral care. This covariate here is the number of non-offspring cared for by the mother, so it should function as a measure of reciprocity. It doesn't say what form, the question doesn't ask what form of reciprocity. what form of care the mother was engaging in with each of those children, just how many children have you helped. To the effect that then measures reciprocity, there's only one form, which is direct matrilineal care. And you can see that care from patrilineal kin is higher in richer households, and there's a sort of negative effect of wealth on matrilineal kin. These are the household economic capital of where the mother is living. And interestingly, and consistent with resource competition models, the more children or siblings a child has, the less likely that child is to receive patrilateral investment, and the more likely that child is to receive matrilateral investment. Again, these are just the number of carers, but of course the number of carers may not equate to direct care. And in fact, when you looked at direct care, the effect of patrilateral religiosity on patrilateral investment disappears. And in these models, this includes paternal investment. And so these are all of the children grouped together from newborns to 15-year-olds. And you can see that both forms of matrilateral investment are associated, increases with mother's religiosity is associated with increases in both forms of matrilateral investment. There's a different variable associated with reciprocity, which is matrilateral provisioning. You see the same relationships with capital, with the father's family investing more heavily in wealthier households and the mother's family investing less. And you again see the same findings consistent with resource competition, differences between the two sides of the family, but this time it also includes fathers, with fathers investing less the more children he has with that wife. By the way, I also looked at the effect of religion on cooperation with co-wives, and there doesn't seem to be an effect, so I'm not going to include it here. In the next two models, I just separate these out by the age of the child, so the two groups, but the results are roughly consistent. Here you actually see a negative effect of mother's religiosity on paternal investment. But you do see increased paternal investment amongst children of higher age. You see the same relationship with household capital. You also see increased paternal investment with greater proximity to markets, which is again consistent with embodied capital theories of the effects of market integration on reproduction. And again, evidence of resource competition between the two sides of the family. You do see in older children less of an effect overall on matrilateral kin, and everything sort of trends positively, but the relationships are much less strong. Everything else is roughly similar in patterning from the earlier for the younger children. Now, in terms of whether or not the increased investment or any alloparental investment is associated with child health, it's really complicated. So these are the results, or maybe difficult for me to interpret. These are the results of two models. One is maternal rated health of the child. The other is the number of illnesses reverse coded. So this would be lower illnesses, just so the two coefficients are in the same direction, because otherwise this plot would be really complicated. But you can see that for each kind of care, paternal, maternal, or patrilateral, direct care is associated with positive outcomes and provisioning is associated with negative outcomes. So if we were to say religion increases matrilateral allocare, does that affect, and these people have higher fertility, or people who tend to be more religious have higher fertility, is that higher fertility mitigated by the increased allocare. If we looked at direct care, maybe it would, but if we looked at provisioning care, we would reveal the opposite relationship of what we would predict. And it is perhaps just this site, but if you look at the cross-cultural data, so these are all of the data with the exception of Malawi, you can see the direction of the relationships are all the same, such that direct care is always associated with positive health outcomes, and provisioning care is always negatively associated, with negative outcomes. This suggests that either this is the way that these patterns are cross-culturally, or this is an artifact of the way that we ask these questions, or some statistical analysis that I did. But when I break these, so I did look at, and I don't have the plots in part of the presentation, but of the different, for Bangladesh and India, separated out by Hindus and Muslims, I think Hindus in Bangladesh, there's a positive relationship between provisioning, alloparenting, and health. So that suggests that maybe these patterns do vary cross-culturally, but this is the consistent pattern. Anyway, this is maybe a problem for interpretation of our data, and also something to think about as we move further with thinking about outcomes using the health measures that we have. So just to summarize what I've talked about today, religious practice, at least how we measured it in the Gambia, is associated with earlier onset of reproduction and higher age-adjusted fertility amongst women who are currently reproductive. Maternal religious practice is not associated with paternal investment, contrary to some theories which posit this as the primary function of religion in contemporary environments. Religious practice is, however, associated with higher levels of parental support from matrilateral kin, and there's a little bit of evidence in terms of the number of patrilateral kin carers, but that doesn't translate to the care score, which I think is maybe a better measure. So I would interpret this as really little evidence that paternity certainty anyway is being communicated through religiosity to evince more care from fathers and the father's kin. Interestingly, although not related to the project hypotheses necessarily, patrilateral kin investment declines with family size, whereas matrilateral investment increases. Even when the coefficient doesn't cross zero, given that there are more children, this would mean that per child investment increases. Forms of allocare are positively affected by religion associated with positive and negative outcomes. So again, this is difficult for interpretation. And I'm really not sure how to move forward with that portion of what we're doing. Just to speculate a little bit, why would religious practice reinforce matrilateral investment in this setting? Anthropologists, since at least Meyer-Fortes, have noted that even in lineal societies, people still affiliate with all of their kin, and other evolutionary studies have done a good job documenting how women in these societies, how often, and the importance of women in patrilocal society, maternal kin in patrilocal societies are. And so, this is not all that surprising, this could sort of be a sort of opportunity for bonding in much the way the evolutionary literatures on religion suggests more generally, although often not from kin. But more practically, if people are getting together, women are getting together with their kin in these settings, it may be an opportunity to discuss practical childcare needs rather than anything that the religion is doing necessarily. Alternatively, there could be something about being a part of these groups, these extra religious practices that may deeply internalize some kind of childcare norms. But really, to understand these dynamics, we would really need to do some qualitative work. I haven't looked at the focus group data, but perhaps there's something in there that could help with this. I think it is worth noting some quick limitations. We are able to adjust for whether or not there are the sort of distance of the maternal kin, or at least whether or not they're in the household. It could be, although we try to generate a random sample of women in a patrilocal society, it could be the case that our sample is biased towards women who are living with their female kin. It doesn't mean there's not a matrilateral bias, but it would mean that it isn't necessarily overcoming geographic limitations. This analysis groups all female kin, all matrilateral kin together. And we haven't yet had time to pull out specific carers to see which type of care may be driving the effect. So in a paper that Laura's had under review for what seems like 3 years, she finds that religion in the UK and in the US, religion is associated with greater alloparenting amongst kin, but that effect seems to be primarily driven by daughters. And so if that's the case here, the mechanisms by which religion may encourage greater care from daughters are likely different than those encouraged by aunts and other forms of maternal kin. Whereas if they're kids, it's probably some kind of socialization and it has nothing to do with the specific practice. Anyway, that's worth considering. This is also dependent upon the way that religion is practiced. As I mentioned in the context of the talk, it was very difficult to construct a religiosity score for this site in particular. And the best alpha, I think, was 0.62, which I suspect psychologists would have a problem with. But when you try to use that, a lot of these relationships do not appear as strong as they are in the presentation that I gave. So it is worth, again, sort of stating that this may be contingent upon the particular form of religion that we're talking about, or at least how religion is assessed. And again, I'll just repeat again, there's complicated relationships between allocare and child health. So that's all that I have. I do want to acknowledge Radim and Moore in particular, who have done a lot of work with these data, but also the local collaborators in Gambia, Andrew, Carla, and Geneva, who is pictured here. So that's all I have. Thank you.